Hello, and welcome back to the Working with Community Conflict series. In this session, Identities and Our Emotional Responses, we'll be looking at the changing nature of identities and imagined communities. We'll also be looking at the impact of emotions and how to work with anger.
Why are these important topics for us to think about, those of our identities and also our emotional responses? When we're working out in communities, it's really important to be aware of how diverse identities within an individual group are operating. We're going to be looking in this session at how we each have our different sense of self. And it's really important when you're working with a group not to find yourself slipping into lumping them into one idea, a single entity. One of the things that we find ourselves involved in very often is thinking about how to build a new sense of common behaviour and identity. And that is going to be very relevant here as we think of how people define themselves and how they see themselves in the world. So how do we form our sense of self? We've already looked back in session 3 at the ladder of inference, which helped us think about how our primary sense of identity is formed by our culture and our upbringing. But in reality, our individual identities change through time and through experience. Today, we're also going to consider some ideas from psychology about social identity theory. Tajfel and Turner did a lot of work on this just after the Second World War, and also the idea of imagined communities. It's important to think about how identities can change rapidly in response to real or perceived threat. Before we think of some new ideas, let's just look back at that ladder of inference and remind ourselves how that works. The idea is, of course, we get born into a certain circumstance at a certain time, and those things are out of our control, but they fundamentally inform how we develop as we grow. I think an interesting part to think about here is the idea of feedback loops, the idea that by the time we've reached out into the world, we have a sense of identity that we're acting from. What tends to happen is that as we go on through the world, we pick information out from around us that reinforces that sense of self rather than challenging it. And these are known as feedback loops. After the Second World War, there was a lot of thinking went on, as we've discussed already, about how to think about what happens with people in groups, and particularly groups in conflict. Obviously, this was related in some degree to what had just happened in World War II, and an absolute determination amongst people of all walks of life not to see that happen again. Tajfel was one person who was thinking about exactly that just after the Second World War, and he came up with this idea of social identity theory, which he wrote about extensively with his colleague Turner, and there's a reference to that at the end of this session. For them, it was important to think of identity as a continuum, a personal and social identity continuum, so that we weren't either one thing or another. We actually all and each and every one of us contained multiple social identities that we inhabited at different times and in different places. In session 3, we looked at, when we were thinking about culture, we looked at our different groups and how we belong to different groups. And that's a very, very similar idea. In fact, it's exactly the same idea as this of social identity. So you might be a married person, but you might also be a working person. You might be a hockey player or a mediator. You're all of these things at the same time. We also have a number of identities which relate to our gender roles and our social roles, our family roles. We're mothers or fathers or brothers or sisters. How do we act in each of those different areas? And at times our identities are in competition, contested. That means that sometimes they're really pulling against each other, and we have to sort out from the inside as an individual where our loyalties lie most, or which is most important to us. In our work, we quite often talk about internal conflict as a way of reflecting those tensions and different directions that are going on inside ourselves. when we're being pulled in opposite directions, that can be very stressful for us as individuals. And a number of these tools and ideas we've been thinking about on the course are also helpful in those circumstances to help us as individuals think through our personal dilemmas. Another aspect of Turner and Tadgefell's work was thinking about social influence. Different people have different degrees of social influence in different situations. And in fact, if I asked you just to stop for a moment here and think about some of the groups that you belong to and where you hold more influence than others, I think you'll quickly see the point. This was of particular interest because it was about who was going to be the leader in these groups, what sorts of leaders were going to come to the fore, and how an ethos of the group would be formed. What is important in this thinking in particular for us is the idea that we have a number of identities, but at any one given moment, one of those identities is our primary identity. It's what we're inhabiting the most, and it's what academics call our salient identity. Salience meaning the thing that is most relevant at the time. I just want you to spend a couple of minutes thinking about what this sentence means to you. In his writing on race and racialisation, Fahad Dalal has been thinking about what exactly is going on when race comes into the picture. He talks about many interesting elements in that, and I've got a page of his notes in the handouts folder that you can go and have a look at if you're interested, and a lead to further writing. But I'm very interested in this particular phrase, strangers are made, not found. Because what it's really saying is that when we meet an individual, how we find that individual is how we approach them. We don't necessarily have to be thinking of people as strangers. That is a language. But it's to do with how we conceptualise the world and our place in it. And when I was thinking about this slide, what came back to my mind was the fact that, say, in Maori, there is no word for enemy. They only have angry friends. And if you think about that, that is just a wonderful idea, and it's also completely evocative of how they conceptualise their world, as opposed to how the way we might think of people that we don't know. So this word strangers, very interesting word. Strangers are made, not found. And what we're really talking about is how do we make people, what do we project onto people when we first meet them? So leading on from the last slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of imagined communities. There's a link to Anderson's book on imagined communities in the reading list, but there has also been a considerable amount of thinking and writing about this idea that community is not just on the ground, but it's in the mind. If you think about it, all the groups that you belong to, we sort of attach a label to it, but they're not exactly concrete groups. Even just thinking about the world, the globe, and the borders, the cultural national borders that we have in place, these are imagined lines. People went around the globe drawing a line on the ground, but if you were flying over the top, you'd see no difference between one country and the next. In some ways, that is how the idea of imagined communities works as well. If we accept that we all are in the process all the time from a psychological level of separating ourselves from another, then what is very interesting is the idea that we actually define who we are by what we are not. Identifying that we're not that, and we're not that, and we're not that, helps us create a border to who we actually are. So those boundaries or borders divide us from them. And writers talk extensively about the idea of boundary markers. I've given you a reference here to Vulcan. What is a boundary marker? What separates us from them? What do I know about myself that they do not know or they are not? Group and community boundaries are physical, but they're also internal, they're also emotional. So they're in the mind and they're also in the feelings. And if other people don't exist, but they're constantly created by us, What is the in-group, out-group dynamic that is created? What's the impact of that in our work in communities? Let's think for a bit about what happens when conflict comes into the picture and what happens to communities as they become under threat or they feel under threat. This idea of a defended community is the idea that people close their borders. Well, when you're on the ground and it's a country that has a problem with another country, they do indeed close their borders. But if it's an imagined community, it's in their mind. It might be a faith group, or it might be a particular sort of approach to education. What happens when people feel that that particular community is under threat? What psychologists talk about is permeable and impermeable boundaries. The idea that permeable boundaries are open and people can move quite freely through them from one community into the other. But as people become under threat, they become impermeable, they become closed, mentally closed, and groups stop engaging in the same way with other groups beyond their own. What inevitably follows is a breakdown in communication. And as we've seen earlier in the series, that is a classic stage in the escalation of conflict. Because as communication breaks down, there is less chance to get to know each other and to understand each other's point of view. And inevitably what happens is stereotyping and lumping people together, and people increasingly become dehumanized. The other emerges. An other becomes the other. As you can see from Koza's quote here, a common enemy unites internal differences. What happens to groups as they feel increasingly under threat is they become more and more single-minded. Their thinking becomes less and less nuanced, and the leadership tends to become more aggressive. Many of you will have come across the idea of groupthink, and this is specifically where that emerges, where groups are encouraged, in fact, are forced to think more and more like each other, as thinking differently is seen as being a traitor or being outside the group norm. And as groups are under threat, it becomes less and less acceptable to be different to the group norm.
For this exercise, we've called it in-group and out-group. What we'd like you to do is, with a partner if possible, or a study group, note down where you come across an in-group, so the majority, and also an out-group or an other group dynamic in your work. So think about what different identities are in play in that dynamic. And when you're looking at this, go back to the idea of groupthink and really think about what's acceptable to say in those circumstances, what's acceptable to think.
We're going on in a moment to think in more depth about emotions and how emotions relate to identities and this same area of what is going on inside ourselves. So here what we're really trying to focus on is the idea of the psychosocial, the idea that the psycho, our internal worlds, is meeting our social worlds, our worlds between other people. And it's very important, as we've been talking through the series, about keeping in mind the out of sight, beneath the surface dynamics that are going on in every situation that you meet. Here, what I think is particularly relevant for our work is the idea of remembering that those in groups know about groups. So the person who is within a particular community understands how it ticks, how it recognises itself, how it signals itself to another. And if we go back to the model that we thought about early in the series of insider partials, those people who can move more easily than others between different groups and set up bridges of communication, in some ways those could be seen as individuals who actually find community boundaries much more permeable than other people. So there are people who actually find it easier to straddle different groups and move between than others. Where are those people? How do we find them? How do we recognise them? Another important aspect of this session is to remember how group dynamics impact on all different kinds of conflict, and that includes our interpersonal conflicts. So as people feel more under threat, their thinking narrows, their sense of being able to be open and generous-hearted closes down, their boundaries tighten. That is just as true when you're in dispute with one single individual as when two groups are in dispute with each other. And it's a good idea to keep that in mind. So these things are important when you're thinking about how to build trust with groups, and also when you're trying to think what identities are in that room. That is not one lumpen group of people. Each of those individuals in a group has multiple identities of their own. So what groups are present when we are talking to people, and which is the most salient, which are the ones that are most significant? And at the same time, we have to stay aware of ourselves and what identities we're bringing into the room, what are being projected onto us, and what also we're talking from and using in our work.
We're now going to ask you to watch another TED Talk by Brené Brown. She's talking about the power of vulnerability, and she's coming from it from a researcher's point of view. In this session, we've been talking about group dynamics, thinking about how when groups are in conflict, thinking closes down, boundaries tighten. What Brené Brown is talking about is how an individual does that to themselves. As always, watch this talk and see how it's personally relevant to you, and therefore understand how it can be relevant to all the different people that are in all the different groups that you will work with.
So I'll start with this. A couple of years ago, an event planner called me because I was going to do a speaking event. And she called and she said, I'm really struggling with how to write about you on the little flyer. And I thought, well, what's the struggle? And she said, well, I saw you speak, and I'm going to call you a researcher, I think, but I'm afraid if I call you a researcher, no one will come because they'll think you're boring and irrelevant. And I was like, okay. And she said, but the thing I liked about your talk is, you're a storyteller, so I think what I'll do is just call you a storyteller. And of course, the academic, insecure part of me was like, you're going to call me a what? And she said, I'm going to call you a storyteller. And I was like, oh, why not Magic Pixie? I was like, let me think about this for a second. And so I tried to call deep on my courage, and I thought, I am a storyteller. I'm a qualitative researcher. I collect stories. That's what I do. And maybe stories are just data with a soul, and maybe I'm just a storyteller. So I said, you know what? Why don't you just say I'm a researcher storyteller? And she went, there's no such thing. So I'm a researcher storyteller. And I'm going to talk to you today. We're talking about expanding perception. And so I want to talk to you and tell some stories about a piece of my research that fundamentally expanded my perception and really actually changed the way that I live and love and work and parent. And this is where my story starts. When I was a young researcher, doctoral student, my first year I had a research professor who said to us, here's the thing, if you cannot measure it, it does not exist. And I thought he was just sweet-talking me. I was like, really? And he's like, absolutely. So you have to understand that I have a bachelor's in social work, a master's in social work, and I was getting my PhD in social work. So my entire academic career was surrounded by people who kind of believed in the life's messy, love it, and I'm more the life's messy, clean it up, organize it, and put it into a bento box. And so to think that I had found my way, to found a career that takes me, really one of the big sayings in social work is lean into the discomfort of the work. And I'm like, knock discomfort upside the head and move it over and get all A's. That was my mantra. So I was very excited about this. And so I thought, you know what? This is the career for me because I am interested in some messy topics, but I want to be able to make them not messy. I want to understand them. I want to hack into these things that I know are important and lay the code out for everyone to see. So where I started was with connection, because by the time you're a social worker for 10 years, what you realize is that connection is why we're here. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. This is what it's all about. It doesn't matter whether you talk to people who work in social justice and mental health and abuse and neglect. What we know is that connection, the ability to feel connected, is neurobiologically, that's how we're wired. It's why we're here. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to start with connection. Well, you know that situation where you get an evaluation from your boss and she tells you 37 things that you do really awesome and one thing that you can't, an opportunity for growth. And all you can think about is that opportunity for growth, right? Well, apparently this is the way my work went as well, because when you ask people about love, they tell you about heartbreak. When you ask people about belonging, they'll tell you their most excruciating experiences of being excluded. And when you ask people about connection, the stories they told me were about disconnection. So very quickly, really about 6 weeks into this research, I ran into this unnamed thing that absolutely unraveled connection in a way that I didn't understand or had never seen. And so I pulled back out of the research and thought, I need to figure out what this is. And it turned out to be shame. And shame is really easily understood as the fear of disconnection. Is there something about me that if other people know it or see it, that I won't be worthy of connection? The things I can tell you about it, it's universal. We all have it. The only people who don't experience shame have no capacity for human empathy or connection. No one wants to talk about it, and the less you talk about it, the more you have it. What underpinned this shame, this I'm not good enough, which we all know that feeling, I'm not blank enough, I'm not thin enough, rich enough, beautiful enough, smart enough, promoted enough. The thing that underpinned this was excruciating vulnerability. This idea of, in order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen, really seen. And you know how I feel about vulnerability. I hate vulnerability. And so I thought, this is my chance to beat it back with my measuring stick. I'm going in, I'm going to figure this stuff out, I'm going to spend a year, I'm going to totally deconstruct shame, I'm going to understand how vulnerability works, and I'm going to outsmart it. So I was ready, and I was really excited. As you know, it's not going to turn out well. You know this. So I could tell you a lot about shame, but I'd have to borrow everyone else's time. But here's what I can tell you that it boils down to. And this may be one of the most important things that I've ever learned in the decade of doing this research. My 1 year has turned into 6 years, thousands of stories, hundreds of long interviews, focus groups. At one point, people were sending me journal pages and sending me their stories, thousands of pieces of data. And 6 years. And I kind of got a handle on it. I kind of understood this is what shame is, this is how it works. I wrote a book, I published a theory, but something was not okay. And what it was is that if I roughly took the people I interviewed and divided them into people who really have a sense of worthiness, that's what this comes down to, a sense of worthiness. They have a strong sense of love and belonging. And folks who struggle for it, and folks who are always wondering if they're good enough. There was only one variable that separated the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging and the people who really struggle for it, and that was the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging believe they're worthy of love and belonging. That's it. They believe they're worthy. And to me, the hard part of the one thing that keeps us out of connection is our fear that we're not worthy of connection, was something that personally and professionally I felt like I needed to understand better. So what I did is I took all of the interviews where I saw worthiness, where I saw people living that way, and just looked at those. What do these people have in common? And I have a slight office supply addiction, but that's another talk. So I had a manila notebook, a manila folder, and I had a Sharpie, and I was like, what am I going to call this research? And the first words that came to my mind were wholehearted. These are kind of wholehearted people living from this deep sense of worthiness. So I wrote at the top of the manila folder, and I started looking at the data. In fact, I did it first in this in a 4-day very intensive data analysis where I went back, pulled these interviews, pulled the stories, pulled the incidents. What's the theme? What's the pattern? My husband left town with the kids because I always go into this kind of Jackson Pollock crazy thing where I'm just like writing and going and kind of just in my researcher mode. And so here's what I found. What they had in common was a sense of courage. And I want to separate courage and bravery for you for a minute. Courage, the original definition of courage, when it first came into the English language, it's from the Latin word cur, meaning heart. And the original definition was to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. And so these folks had, very simply, the courage to be imperfect. They had the compassion to be kind to themselves first and then to others, because as it turns out, we can't practice compassion with other people if we can't treat ourselves kindly. And the last was they had connection, and this was the hard part, as a result of authenticity. They were willing to let go of who they thought they should be in order to be who they were, which is, you have to absolutely do that for connection. The other thing that they had in common was this. They fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. They didn't talk about vulnerability being comfortable, nor did they really talk about it being excruciating, as I had heard earlier in the shame interviewing. They just talked about it being necessary. They talked about the willingness to say, I love you first. The willingness to do something where there are no guarantees. The willingness to breathe through waiting for the doctor to call after your mammogram. The willing to invest in a relationship that may or may not work out. They thought this was fundamental. I personally thought it was betrayal. I could not believe I had pledged allegiance to research, where our job, the definition of research is to control and predict, to study phenomenon for the explicit reason to control and predict. And now my mission to control and predict had turned up the answer that the way to live is with vulnerability and to stop controlling and predicting. This led to a little breakdown, which actually looked more like this. And it did. It led to I call it a breakdown, my therapist calls it a spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening sounds better than breakdown, but I assure you it was a breakdown. And I had to put my data away and go find a therapist. Let me tell you something. You know who you are when you call your friends and say, I think I need to see somebody. Do you have any recommendations? Because about 5 of my friends are like, woo, I wouldn't want to be your therapist. And I was like, what does that mean? And they're like, I'm just saying, don't bring your measuring stick. It's like, okay. So I found a therapist. My first meeting with her, Diana, I brought in my list of the way the wholehearted live. And I sat down, and she said, how are you? And I said, I'm great, I'm okay. And she said, what's going on? And I said, and this is a therapist who sees therapists, because we have to go to those because their BS meters are good. And so I said, here's the thing, I'm struggling. And she said, what's the struggle? And I said, well, I have a vulnerability issue, and I know that vulnerability is kind of the core of shame and fear and our struggle for worthiness, but it appears that it's also the birthplace of joy, of creativity, of belonging, of love, and I think I have a problem, and I need some help. And I said, but here's the thing, no family stuff, no childhood shit, I just need some strategies. Thank you. So she goes like this. And then I said, "It's bad, right?" And she said, "It's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is." And I said, "Oh my God, this is gonna suck." And it did, and it didn't. And it took about a year. And you know how there are people that, like, when they realize that vulnerability and tenderness are important, that they kind of surrender and walk into it? A, that's not me. And B, I don't even hang out with people like that. For me, it was a year-long street fight. It was a slugfest. Vulnerability pushed, I pushed back. I lost the fight, but probably won my life back. And so then I went back into the research and spent the next couple of years really trying to understand what they, the wholehearted, what the choices they were making, and what are we doing with vulnerability? Why do we struggle with it so much? Am I alone in struggling with vulnerability? No. So this is what I learned. We numb vulnerability. When we're waiting for the call, it was funny, I sent something out on Twitter and on Facebook that says, how would you define vulnerability? What makes you feel vulnerable? And within an hour and a half, I had 150 responses. Because I wanted to know, what's out there. Having to ask my husband for help because I'm sick and we're newly married. Initiating sex with my husband. Initiating sex with my wife. Being turned down. Asking someone out. Waiting for the doctor to call back, getting laid off, laying off people. This is the world we live in. We live in a vulnerable world. And one of the ways we deal with it is we numb vulnerability. And I think there's evidence, and it's not the only reason this evidence exists, but I think that it's a huge cause. We are the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in U.S. history. The problem is, and I learned this from the research, that you cannot selectively numb emotion. You can't say, here's the bad stuff. Here's vulnerability, here's grief, here's shame, here's fear, here's disappointment. I don't want to feel these. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. I don't want to feel these. And I know that's knowing laughter. I hack into your lives for a living. I know that's, God. You can't numb those hard feelings without numbing the other affects or emotions. You cannot selectively numb. So when we numb those, we numb joy. We numb gratitude. We numb happiness. And then we are miserable, and we are looking for purpose and meaning. And then we feel vulnerable, so then we have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. And it becomes this dangerous cycle. One of the things that I think that we need to think about is why and how we numb. And it doesn't just have to be addiction. The other thing we do is we make everything that's uncertain, certain. Religion has gone from a belief in faith and mystery to certainty. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. That's it. Just certain. The more afraid we are, the more vulnerable we are, the more afraid we are. This is what politics looks like today. There's no discourse anymore. There's no conversation. There's just blame. You know how blame is described in the research? A way to discharge pain and discomfort. We perfect. If there's anyone who wants their life to look like this, it would be me. But it doesn't work, because what we do is we take fat from our butts and put it in our cheeks. Which just, I hope in 100 years people will look back and go, wow. And we perfect, most dangerously, our children. Let me tell you what we think about children. They're hardwired for struggle when they get here. When you hold those perfect little babies in your hand, our job is not to say, look at her, she's perfect. My job is just to keep her perfect, make sure she makes the tennis team by 5th grade and Yale by 7th grade. That's not our job. Our job is to look and say, you know what? You're imperfect and you're wired for struggle, but you are worthy of love and belonging. That's our job. Show me a generation of kids raised like that, and we'll end the problems I think that we see today. We pretend that what we do doesn't have an effect on people. We do that in our personal lives. We do that corporate, whether it's a bailout, an oil spill, a recall. We pretend like what we're doing doesn't have a huge impact on other people. I would say to companies, this is not our first rodeo, people. We just need you to be authentic and real and say, we're sorry, we'll fix it. But there's another way, and I'll leave you with this. This is what I have found: to let ourselves be seen, deeply seen, vulnerably seen. To love with our whole hearts, even though there's no guarantee. And that's really hard, and I can tell you as a parent, that's excruciatingly difficult. To practice gratitude and joy in those moments of kind of terror when we're wondering, can I love you this much? Can I believe in this as passionately? Can I be this fierce about this? Just to be able to stop and instead of catastrophizing what might happen, to say, I'm just so grateful, because to feel this vulnerable means I'm alive. And the last, which I think is probably the most important, is to believe that we're enough. Because when we work from a place, I believe, that says, I'm enough, then we stop screaming and start listening. We're kinder and gentler to the people around us, and we're kinder and gentler to ourselves. That's all I have.